As it happens, the saint of this day could have been related to our family because of the name. He was John Buckley Jones, and the Buckley Jones has come down on my mother's side from the north of Wales. He was from our area anyway, but he went and became first of all a priest, and then, already ordained, entered the Franciscan order. His birthplace was not far from our home. He was in the Clonogvawr area, which was already sanctified by a great saint way back, St. Beno, the uncle of St. Winifred. If one has access to a part of the church, one can place one's thumb where he placed his thumb, because when St. Beno made a treaty, an agreement with the local landlord for this plot of land, he made this sign of the cross with his thumb in the stone, but the stone gave way and left a perfect imprint of the sign of the cross, and if one puts one's thumb there, it fits perfectly. He one day was celebrating Holy Mass, and he heard something awful going on. He discovered that his niece, Winifred, a beautiful young maiden from a noble family, was being martyred for not yielding to desires of Prince Caraddoc. She wanted to keep her virginity and give herself to the Lord, and he, with a sword, chopped off her head, which fell to the ground, whence gushed forth, and still gushes forth to this day, the miraculous waters of St. Winifred at Holywell, Holy Well, named after her, the Lord of Wales, which has still graffiti there going way back across the centuries, indicating that the miracle has never stopped, even in penal times. Indeed, people would go and get healed even though they were not Catholic. They were grateful for the healing, and they would wink at each other and say, "Oh, what wonderful water." And everyone got the message. But he, hearing this awful noise going on, came and miraculously healed that head. And she lived on and became abbess at Gutherin. John Jones became Franciscan at Pontoise in France. Around 1590. He was professed in Rome at the Araceli Church in 1591 and returned to England to work in and near London the following year. In this he has something in common with our own local martyr from a little bit further south, which was also very important to us because we had the Welsh Mass there every month, and the Word of Life also of the Focolare movement, St. John Roberts, who was also ministering to people in a plague-stricken London a little later, and was caught at the altar and hanged, drawn and quartered at Tyburn in 1610. Now, as for St. John Jones, having in common with him, of course, the Welsh language and the Welsh culture, with the same accent, virtually, he became associated with Henry Garnet. He was the great underground Jesuit who organised the whole underground movement, a very dangerous movement and much hated by the authorities. many Jesuits were working, and others also were working associated with them, so that the poor English people could still have access to the sacraments. Under him was, for instance, Father Gerard, who was tortured in the Tower of London, and we have his diary because he escaped, unbelievably. But he also celebrated more than once in the Tower of London Holy Mass, and of course in secret. It was amazing how he managed to do that kind of thing. And when one celebrates in the old rite, one is aware of these. One can hear the centuries whispering in the ear. This has happened before, and in many diverse places and circumstances. It was the same in the wars, it was the same in all persecutions, the unchanging mass of the centuries. It was, of course, in penal times in Ireland, the same exactly. And in the case of St. John Roberts, he was caught actually at the altar at the last Gospel. In 1597, so he didn't have all that much time to be able to minister, he was arrested and kept in prison for a year, pending the collection of evidence. The charge was that as a priest ordained abroad, he had returned to minister in England. These were referred to as the Marsing priests. They were much hunted and hated. He was found guilty on his own admission and was executed on this very day, the 12th of July, at St. Thomas Waterings on the Old Kent Road in Southwark. Now, during an hour's delay on the scaffold, because the executioner had forgotten his rope, Jones asserted that he had never entertained even the thought of treason. He was canonized by St. Paul VI in 1970 as one of the 40 martyrs. I remember the occasion well. We celebrated that hugely in the grounds of Cardiff Castle. A massive high mass. It was beautiful, and it was on that day that it was all happening in Rome. And we heard afterwards on the radio the voice of Paul VI in Latin pronouncing these Welsh names. Fascinating. Well, our own parish, because it served the area, the parish of Carnarvon, had, when I was there, a second church, which Canon McNamara, who was a Welsh-speaking Irishman, he learned very well the language, had managed to purchase from the Wesleyans and to transform it into a Catholic church. And we were still collecting money for the roof fund. Maybe that was the roof fund of the other church he purchased, the Anglican Church of St. David's, which he'd also transformed into a Catholic church. But anyway, it wasn't long purchased, and I remember more than once going there. In fact, once a month there would be the Welsh Mass there. It was difficult to celebrate it because English tourists would come and they would answer in English and make it difficult to reply in Welsh for the responses of the Holy Mass. That was at Llanberis. Unfortunately, in a short time, the new bishop closed a large number of churches, and the first ones to go were the small ones in the country, so that went immediately nearly. We haven't got any more. And also we're a bit afraid about Gellilodan, because that's the other one that's dearest to us for John Roberts. That's a country church, but hitherto we've managed to keep that one open. Anyway, all this to say that these saints are very close to us, and we had the experience with St. John Roberts indicating how close he was to us, because when the major relic we had at Gellilodan was requisitioned by the Curia, the relic, which had been in completely whole and well preserved for centuries, started to disintegrate, indicating that St. John Roberts didn't want to be moved from his area. We had signs of his power of intercession. Unfortunately now, with the Church of St. John Jones Gualbert closed, there is not a single church in honour of St. John Jones, and he may just, as it were, fade into oblivion. These were Welsh-speaking local people. Another in the area of our local farm, because the farming has gone on with the sheep farming there, a little bit further down in mid-Wales, in Powys, in the hills, we had St. Richard Gwyn, actually a poet, and he was a school teacher, and there are fascinating things about his martyrdom and the time that led into it. One time he compromised slightly, and to obey, conform exteriorly, he deigned to go to the local state church and prayed the consecration would be valid that day. But it wasn't, and when he came out of church, having received the Anglican communion, horrible, huge birds pecked at where the particle was in his stomach, and he understood that was a sign he was never to do it again. When he came to his martyrdom, he was so popular that they couldn't find anyone who was willing to do the work as executioner. Someone had to be called in. These then are our brethren. We notice that both John Roberts and John Jones didn't get back to Wales, and that was the pattern. They couldn't get back to Wales. They got as far as England, and the faith in Wales actually, even though it was there strongly, as one can see from the names of the flowers, so many flowers named after our Blessed Lady, and the oldest hymns in Wales are two Marian ones, which have gone on from pre-Reformation times in the Welsh language. Min Mair is one of them. What one sees is that the faith died not because the people didn't have it, but because they had no priests. The priests couldn't get back, and they died of anemia without receiving the blood of Christ. And so it had to become whatever it became with the centuries, without priests. First of all Anglican, and then with the waves of revival it became free church. And by the way, there's a problem in Wales right now which one is picking up, and it's the fact that the real Welsh are not attracted to it because it's not Welsh. It's only the Welsh speaking the language and the culture of the Welsh who get through to the Welsh, and the Welsh themselves say about it that it's an alien church. They go therefore to what they're familiar with. It's a pity, because it would be a great way of healing this terrible split. Because the church of the centuries, after all, is that of St. David. There one finds continuity. There was no need to opt for something which was not sacramental. The problem is linked with this, that the Welsh have always had their own way of doing things, very much linked with the beauty of song and the power of preaching, and therefore the Welsh themselves would compare when they go from one place to another. It causes problems when they have, as it were, in the local Protestant church, great preaching and great singing, and in the Catholic Church something not as good. It's a complex issue, but it does count. We have to take on board the whole of culture if we are to be effective. I close that parenthesis. The other saint feasted on this day is earlier in time. As it happens, I was ordained in Siena Cathedral with Dom Guido, who was a Vallambrosian. Now, the Archbishop of Siena who had founded us founded also them, the Eremo della Vita Eterna, near Siena. So two of us were ordained together, and he has since become an exorcist. And it was a small community under the Vallambrosians, and therefore they would frequently be naming St. John Gualbert, Giovanni Gualberto. He was born in 995 and died in 1073. He was a member of the noble Florentine family, the Bisdomini. We know that one important event happened when he was in the world. It was the unexpected meeting with his brother's murderer, one Good Friday. Custom required that John should kill him in revenge. But the defenseless murderer asked for pardon and crossed his arms. Faithful to Christ's teaching, John forgave his enemy and spared his life. Soon afterwards he became a monk at San Miniato in Florence. That's on the hill just outside the centre of Florence, and it's a beautiful monastery under the Olivetan Benedictines now. But something happened. Several years later, after a disputed abbatial election, John left this monastery with one companion in search of a more austere and contemplative life, untouched by current abuses in the church. There was, for instance, the issue of simony, of which the Archbishop of Florence was a notorious example. Now, John visited St. Romuald's monastery at Camaldoli, which is not far from Florence, but set up his own at Vallambrosa, Shady Valley, about 20 miles east of Florence. Here, silence, poverty and enclosure safeguarded the observance of St. Benedict's rule. On ground donated by a local abbess, they built a small monastery of wood. To prevent the choir monks being overburdened with manual work, John instituted lay brothers, a concept developed with notable success by the Cistercians a century later. The Camaldolis are still there at Camaldoli, and actually the Carthusians took on also the concept of lay brothers. And Selignac, where I was for 7 years, had to close in the end because there weren't enough lay brothers. There were enough choir monks, but the lay brothers are essential to the structure, and the choir monks can't exist without them. John himself never became a priest. He had a reputation for prophecy, healing, and feeding the hungry poor, even by miracle. He died at the age of about 80, and his order expanded considerably in the Middle Ages. Like the Carthusians of St. Bruno, it was reduced considerably in numbers in later centuries, but still survives today. I've actually been to Vallambrosa, it's a nice monastery, it's still there. He was canonized in 1193. These then are those who have marched before us unto glory. This was a period of great floraison of new communities and congregations. St. Romuald was very keen on solitude and had the double formula of both the cenobium and the eremo. He spent himself long periods as a recluse. There is something about the desert which still attracts, and we need to build it, if we can't have it easily, by finding spaces where we can hear again that sound of silence. For we cannot protect our soul if we don't. We are not meant to hear words all day and even all night. And if we do, we cannot hear the word. Abbiamo oggi la festa locale nel Gallese di San Giovanni Jones, che forse è legato con la nostra famiglia, perché questo Buckley Jones figura nella nostra genealogia, era del nord, stessa zona, e lui era onorato nella nostra parrocchia. Purtroppo la chiesa sua, seconda chiesa, ormai è chiusa. E simile all'altro santo locale, San John Roberts, e tutti e due erano martiri del sacerdozio, appunto, il gran peccato del tempo. Purtroppo non hanno potuto tornare nel Gallese, e per questa mancanza di sacerdozi, purtroppo il sacerdozio valido è morto la fede essenzialmente con i secoli nel Gallese, perché non potevano tornare fino al Gallese, arrivavano soltanto fino all'Inghilterra, e con il tempo il Gallese ha perso i sacramenti e la fede cattolica. Quando uno celebra la vecchia messa, uno sente un po' la continuità, perché anche loro sono morti per questa messa, celebrandolo in difficoltà massima e rischio grande. Fu celebrata anche nella torre di Londra, là dove i martiri erano prima torturati, tutto in segreto. E anche la festa di San Giovanni Gualbert, fondatore dei Valorosiani, una riforma, come tante riforme dell'epoca, insistenza sul silenzio, la separazione dal mondo, l'autenticità. E lui non fu mai ordinato prete, anche se era abate, era un carisma basato sulla semplicità della preghiera, come nei pariti del deserto. Questa bellezza del deserto è da proteggere, a ritrovare. Senza questo spazio sacro si fa fatica a sentire la parola, perché ci sono troppe parole in giro. Ani, 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 langano maci, ani namani masasha studi, ani, 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 masifune mati, God in three persons, Blessed Trinity, holy, 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 all the saints adore thee, casting down the golden crowns around the glossy sea. Cherubim and seraphim falling down before thee, worship me. Holy, 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 though the darkness hide thee, though the eyes of sinful man the glory may not see, only thou art holy, there is none beside thee, perfect in power, in love and purity. Holy, holy, holy.